Hi and welcome to the Science Fantasy Experience and to the Toys of Christmas Past. I'm going to take you down memory lane and talk to you about Christmas growing up in the 1980s for myself through the years 1985 to 1989. I've chosen those years as that's kind of when Christmas slightly changed for me, the dynamic of Christmas and the toys that I got for those years. Prior to that, in the early 80s, I used to share my bedroom with my brother. We had bunk beds, and because my brother was 7 years older than me, by 1985, you know, he was 14, I was 7, so you know we had our own rooms. But those early years of the 80s, it was very much my parents would fill pillowcases with our presents and sneak them into our room whilst we were asleep at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you'd get up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and we'd open them together, or we'd nip downstairs first to get drinks and see if Santa had come, because we would have left out a carrot for the reindeer, and we would choose what drink for Santa, and there was always cans of beer in the fridge, and we would choose which drinks for Santa. Santa apparently liked two drinks. He liked white wine and he liked Skol. One year I chose a different beer, but Santa didn't like that one, so another beer got drank. But yes, we would do that up until 1984 maybe. If you wanted to know what toy I got in 1984, then check out episode 4 of my Childhood Toys series, and you will see what toy and a review of said toy. But let's start in 1985. So as I said, in 1985, that's when the dynamic changed with me having my own bedroom. And the way that Christmas worked was a bit sort of not untraditional or anything, but I never wrote a letter to Father Christmas. It was just something that we never did in my family. And I never asked my parents for specific toys or presents. I always wanted a surprise, and that's what I very much got through the 80s. I never made a list. I never chose, I want this toy, I want that colouring book, I want this, I want that. It was always just a surprise. So in 1985, we stopped getting, in some ways, lots of small presents, and we had one present, which was often maybe a little bit more expensive or bigger. And 1985, I got a board game. I got Build a Better Burger, which to this day is still my favourite board game ever. Don't get me wrong, Ghost Castle comes a strong second. I had that for my birthday that same year. What's not to like about Ghost Castle? It's like a live action Scooby-Doo board game with moving parts and glow-in-the-dark pieces. But Build a Better Burger was just phenomenal. It was so unexpected, and I loved board games as a kid. And kind of previous to that, I'd only really played Operation and Snakes and Ladders and some god-awful game that we got given one year called Bird in the Hand, which was really lame. You had to go around as a tiny I'm going to say like a starling or a house martin, collecting eggs and putting them into your little nest. Lame. Build a Better Burger was ridiculously good. You know, it had a menu that spun round and you had to build that burger in the quickest time against your opponent. Tiny little plastic pieces that you'd slot on together. What made that game so interesting was that I'd never really been to fast food places. It wasn't the done thing with my family. I'd been to McDonald's once. Obviously you'd seen it in the movies, but yeah, I'd just not been to McDonald's. So the pure enjoyment of that game is incredible. And it's a board game that you can actually play on your own. You could sit there and play it and roll the dice, see which burger you had to make, and because I would play it on my own until I took it round to my cousins, that I was so good at it. And it had a tier system, so you had level 1, 2 and 3, the 3 being the hardest. So I would always be put at a disadvantage, so being at a higher level where my opponents would be on an easier one. Incredible board game to have. And that was 1985. Moving on to 1986 was the one and only time that my brother and I had a joint present, and that was the Commodore 64, the Hollywood pack. And it came with Rambo First Blood, Miami Vice, Top Gun, The Great Escape and Platoon. It was very much a shared present because my brother wanted to do all of the programming because he was, you know, kind of a bit older, and he'd done a bit on the Spectrum 48K, but because the Commodore 64 was so much more advanced, he was going to use that for programming as well as playing a couple of games, being that a lot of those titles were actually 18 movies. And if you've ever watched my videos before when I've spoken about my brother, we would watch 18 movies a lot. So I would always play Rambo First Blood. I played Miami Vice a few times, but it was a bit poor. My brother played The Great Escape a hell of a lot. I know that he loved that movie and he liked that kind of play. We never played Top Gun, and I played Platoon quite a bit because it was really interesting side-scrolling, but then you'd go in underground and it was a really tough game. The memory I do have though with 1986, you know, unbeknownst to me that we were having a Commodore 64, I probably think my brother knew we were getting that, but that year I was desperate for like the Starcom command center because I'd already got throughout the year, whether it have been through pocket money or little gifts, some of the smaller vehicles. I had one of the tanks and I had the little starfighter. So I was just like, I really wanted like a play set to go with those 2 other vehicles I had. And I remember being quite upset, as kids do on Christmas Day when you don't get the thing that you want, you cry. And you shouldn't be disappointed, and I wasn't disappointed at all with the Commodore 64. It was an incredible present to have. But part of me was just like, oh my god, I kind of wanted a toy that year. The Commodore 64 in 1986, you know, and we had that computer for years and years. I didn't end up selling it until years later at a car boot. So yeah, that's 1986. Moving on to 1987, and this one was a huge surprise. Just like all the years before, you know, I'd not made a list, and this is the one that it's a really interesting story that I didn't find out until years later. My parents were a little bit worried because they'd bought me this, and they'd bought me this from Mothercare, which was very much a younger age range for toys back in the 80s, and still to this day. But I got Manta Force from Bluebird Toys, one of the UK's leading toy manufacturers of the time. That blew me away, and I couldn't understand when my parents told me a few years ago that they were worried about it, because this toy is ridiculously good. It comes in a giant box, like the biggest box ever. You know, imagine seeing a huge wrapped up present, you know, as a 9-year-old, and just seeing it. I knew nothing about Manta Force. I don't remember any sort of TV advertising, and my parents just said that they saw it there in Mothercare and bought it because it was incredible value for money. You know, a giant playset, one spaceship that turns into two with like 10 vehicles inside, and a whole slew of figures and a couple of bad guys. And the Christmas of 1987, I played with that toy all day long. There was so much to play with it, and I played with it for years and years. I still have that toy now. It's not my original, because I donated that to a children's hospice, along with a lot of my toys, in the early 90s, mid 90s. So I picked it up again, maybe about 5 years ago, and it's one hell of a toy, for sure. Just thinking about that day, that Christmas day, it's a standout day for me. 1987, Manta Force. So, 1988, where does it go from here? Well, 1988 was very much the start of Lego System, and space was morphing into Blacktron and Futron, but this was the very last part of kind of what is now referred to as classic space, and it is set 6783 Sonar Transmitting Center Space Shuttle. You can see that it is the classic space because the helmets are of the old style, and it's got some of the old kind of Lego parts prior to what they did with, you know, the new introduction of how Space Lego was going to be. Again, a huge box, an incredible build. It separates into 4 parts. You know, the bit at the front turns into a shuttle. There's 2 little kind of pods, which are little command centers, and then a little buggy at the end, but it has lights and sounds, you know, 2 different sirens and flashing lights. I'd not had space Lego for years and years prior to that, since I was very young, and it was just an absolute joy to have Lego again of that style. I'd got a couple of town pieces throughout the kind of the past couple of years, and kind of everything had just been bundled into the Lego box of random pieces. But to have a brand new set, and especially Space Lego was always my favourite, along with Town. And again, just like before, it was a real joy to open, build and play with. And again, another day where you just played with that toy all day. So finally, onto the last year of the decade, 1989. 1989, I got the Matchbox Motor City 550, which again, more lights and sounds. I'd always had Matchbox cars. There was always a tub under my bed full of Matchbox cars because they were easy pocket money pickups here and there. I think it cost maybe like £1 up to maybe £1.50 for a Matchbox car, which, you know, I'd maybe get 50p a week, and then it topped up to £1. So I would possibly spend, you know, a couple of weeks saving up my pocket money and then go to the local newsagents, Preedies, as it was known back in Wolverhampton, and then it went to Dillon's, but I would pick up a Matchbox car here and there, and then to have a kind of working garage with a ramp, moving doors, garages, you know, lift up parts, petrol pumps, a mat, and, you know, the tuning station. It was a really fun, cool thing to have, and to already kind of have the Matchbox cars ready for it to go. I very much know that was my dad's choice for me to have as a Christmas present. Again, it comes in a giant box. It's half the fun of opening your presents as a child is seeing the size of the box. Irregardless of, you know, what's inside, you always think the big box is going to be the best toy. Half the time it is. Yeah, that was an incredibly awesome gift to have at the end. You know, I was 11 by the time the end of the 80s, still very much into toys. It wasn't until I was 12, 13 that toys stopped being so important to me. But those were the toys that I got growing back then. I think back with such fond memories of my Christmas days and the toys that I have. I've been lucky enough to reacquaint myself with some of the toys of my childhood. I would love to own Build a Better Burger once again, because we have quite the board game collection now. And maybe part of me would love to see the Motor City 550 once again. Maybe not to own it, but just to see it one more time, just to get those real nostalgia feels once again. Christmas is such a wonderful time of the year, and I urge you to think back of some of the childhood memories that you have surrounding Christmas, because this year has been one hell of a year with COVID-19, the coronavirus. We need to think back to more simpler, pleasant times where we're not dealing with a global pandemic. But in terms of the global pandemic, do please stay home, stay safe, stay strong, irregardless of what tier you're in. Enjoy the time that you have with the family you can spend it with. Follow the rules. And from myself, I wish you a very Merry Christmas.